Hello, everyone. I know we're joining each other through different time zones from the west to the east in Canada, and we've got South Africa. We've got a lot of different time zones happening. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Yvette. I'm a reviewer for the South African Film Festival based in BC, the Canadian version. And I've been a reviewer for 2 years now, so I've become a super fan of South African films. So I'm really feel very privileged to be moderating this session. So I'm going to just a little teaser for everyone who is joining us, just to say that this is going to be a discussion about filmmaking, about activism, and also about sustainability. And we'll focus obviously on the film, Jozi Gold, on South Africa, but we're also going to bring it full circle back to BC and to Canada, and really talk about some of the impact campaigns around mining that have taken place in South Africa and around the world, but particularly South Africa and then Canada. So I'm going to start by just introducing you as our panelists. And I know there's a lot to say about all of you. You all have very full careers and fascinating careers, but I'm just going to focus on a little bit so that we can get right into the meat of the discussion about Jozi Gold and about mining. So I'll start with you, Sylvia. Sylvia Vollenhoven is a writer. She's an award-winning journalist, a playwright, and a filmmaker, and very esteemed in South Africa. And again, I'm sure there's a lot more to say about Sylvia and her career, and I encourage everyone to check that out on the internet. But Sylvia was the director of the film, co-director, and also a producer on the film. Next, I'm going to introduce Mariette Liefferink. Mariette is the CEO of the Federation for Sustainable Development. The FSE is widely recognized as the most prominent of the environmental activist stakeholders in the mining industry in Africa, and was a finalist in the 2019-2020 NSTF South 32 Awards in recognition of an outstanding contribution to science, engineering, technology, and innovation. And for those of you who have watched the film or will watch the film, you'll also see that Mariette came to this type of activism in a very interesting way. And I think that's very much the focus of the film. And then our third panelist is actually from here in Canada. Jamie Kneen is MiningWatch Canada's outreach coordinator and Canada's program co-lead. He's responsible for MiningWatch's work in Western and Northern Canada, national and international policy areas, strategic research and communication, and the organization's Africa program. And again, I encourage all of you to look at the Jozi Gold Facebook page at the end of this, and also the MiningWatch page. Jamie has a number of really fascinating blogs, and I think he's going to mention some of that work too in the context of this interview. So that was a lot of teasers. So hopefully everybody is timed for the interview. So I'm going to start really on the filmmaking side, because as a reviewer for the festival, I was really fascinated by how this film got to be made and some aspects of it. So I'm going to start with the first question for you, Sylvia. So what motivated you to make this film? And if you could give us some background about how you got involved in this project.
Hello, Yvette. I'm so glad the film is showing in your part of the world. I got interested in Mariette's work primarily because she featured a lot in the South African media, but specifically in a small investigative journalism magazine called Noseweek. And then later on, the story is based on a story that a journalist called Adam Wells, a South African journalist, primarily print, was following. And Adam is friends with our the film editor, Stefan Sontloff, who is based in Norway. And Adam spoke to Stefan. He had been following Mariette for several years, fascinated with her story, but he needed assistance to finish the film. And at that point, Stefan spoke with my co-director, Fredrik Gerten at WG Films in Sweden. And Fredrik and I are not just colleagues, we're also friends who go way back more than 30 years. And Fredrik said, yes, he loved the story, he was interested, but he would only do a South African story if I could be a co-producer, co-director, to really just ground the story and bring in extra South African characters. And that's how it began.
That's fascinating. And especially the fact that it covers 3 different countries, and there's, you know, these this larger context to the film is really interesting.
Yeah, it's a co-production between Norway, Sweden, and South Africa.
Okay. And was that the first time you've had that type of dynamic in film, or is that something that you commonly worked with?
I've done this in the theater, but in film, this was the first time that I worked together. Frederick and I worked together as journalists, but as filmmakers, it's the first time that we've worked together in this way.
Well, that cohesion definitely came across. It was very interesting, and it takes me to the very opening scene where Mariette has her spike heel peep toe pumps, and she's walking through a very rocky area. And I just wondered, with the high heels, the lovely dresses, the bright lipstick, the interesting earrings, she's the antithesis of what we think of as someone who's an activist. So kind of an not what we think of when you think of an eco activist. So I just wondered how you use that personal brand and that uniqueness in the film and to drive the narrative. That was something really different.
I think Mariette's personality just grabs you from the moment you meet her, and that decision was embedded in the process of the filmmaking. Not just the way she looks, but trying to get across her personality the way she is. Because let's face it, I come from a background of activism, of anti-apartheid activism as a journalist, and a lot of activists and activism is pretty serious and sometimes deathly serious. And we are dealing with really, really serious topics. And so if we can somehow get a balance, in our approach, it really just helps the audience to pull them in. It helps to pull in your audience. And yes, in a way, we were exploiting it, Mariette's image, probably a little bit mercilessly, but all with the intention of grabbing a new audience. I don't really like preaching to the converted. It's wonderful to make films for green lefty people all around the world, and they will come to the festivals and they will watch and they will feel bad. But you need to grab new audiences to really change things.
That's interesting too, Sylvia, because that was the first thing I thought, because doing a lot of reviews, we review quite a number of documentaries. And I started thinking, mining, this is interesting. And then as soon as I saw that, I was intrigued. So it was almost an element of suspense for me, because I was curious. I kept thinking, what's going on here? Why is she wearing those peep toe pumps? I don't understand. So there's almost an element of suspense, which you don't usually see in a documentary. So it was definitely what you were aiming for me as a viewer. Definitely that grabbed me, and it made me curious about how this person would become an activist and what would her journey.
Absolutely. And when you're a documentary filmmaker, and I don't want to talk about Mariette as if she's not in the room, but just you look for character. That's the first thing you look for. It's the most important part of your journey as a documentary filmmaker, is to find a character. Because if you not just find a character, but you find a way of bringing that character to your audience, then you've got your audience relating to the film. And to do Mariette's character justice, she's a very, very serious activist, very effective person. To do it justice, we needed to show the full complexity of who she is, rather than just a kind of narrow side of her being.
Yeah, well, and I think that was very, very successful, very successfully done. And Mariette, we are going to get to you, so you're going to be able to tell your own story. So no worries. One more question though for Sylvia before we get to that point. So now, what was that initial introduction like when you first met Mariette, Sylvia? I'm curious about that. And then Mariette, I'm going to ask you, and we're going to move on to your impressions. But what did you think when you first met her? Did that make you curious? Did that inject an element of suspense for you as well?
I'm going to be very honest. As I said, coming from a background of activism, I've had my fill of middle-class, worthy white people being activists on my behalf, especially within the anti-apartheid context. And there was always some kind of tension between the people in the middle of apartheid living it and the people coming in as activists to declare solidarity. You know, there was never kind of an easy relationship. So that kind of historic tension, plus the usual race tensions in South Africa, I was a little bit hesitant about this. And in fact, I'd said to Frederick, first I will meet Mariette and then see how we get on before I make the decision or give you a firm answer about whether I'll be a co-producer or and co-direct on the film. And then I went to meet Mariette at her home in Johannesburg. And South Africans who speak Afrikaans have a way of navigating those tensions with language. And so once you really get face to face with somebody and you speak the same language, a lot of the tensions drop away almost automatically. And the rest was kind of dealt with by the fact that I could instantly sense and understand that Mariette has a huge amount of integrity and is brutally honest. You know, she will not say something she does not mean, and she will not be nice to you if it doesn't come from her heart. And so that kind of instant honesty and the language connection, and the fact is that South Africans come from an extremely problematic background, but what is amazing is that within minutes they can break down walls that has taken many, many years to build up, if they have that kind of warmth of humanity and an honest approach. And so that's what I found with Mariette, and it drew me into the project instantly.
That's interesting too, because as a person of color myself, watching the film in those the opening sequence, I thought, why is this white South African woman speaking for this group? And I think I went down the same thought path you did, but you know, obviously Mariette, your brilliant personality, of course, won the day. And I did understand more and just what you've brought to this discussion and what you've brought to this whole area and the impact you've had. But I have to admit that as a person of color, I was thinking that too. I thought, I don't know how I feel about this. I don't know if I'm okay with it. So that's interesting. So I'm glad you shared that. I think that makes a lot of sense. So Mariette, really, I'm over to you. You're very much the star of the show, but more importantly, your journey into activism in this area is so important. So I'm going to start with you back at the beginning too. And I'm curious to know, when you entered this arena, were you aware of how different you were? Were you aware of your uniqueness in that? And then once you were aware, do you think that it's always been an advantage to you because you catch people off guard with it? So over to you.
Well, first, before I respond to your question, perhaps prefatory, just to thank Sylvia and also the other producers and the colleagues that also manufactured this film. I'm very deeply grateful for that, and I do feel the praise is very unmerited. It's undeserved, but it is very flattering, and it also instills, well, an acknowledgement that perhaps the activism had not been in vain. So for that, I'm deeply grateful. With regards to my appearance and my style, I did not understand at the time that I was different. I was just genuinely myself. I did not want to portray someone that is not myself. In time, however, I did become embarrassed because I did see that I was dressed quite in an ostentatious manner, big earrings, bracelets and Chinese dresses, which perhaps at that stage was not appropriate. But the mining executives did receive me with respect. I, of course, do not know what their feelings were or opinions of me in private, but I have toned down on my style, perhaps because I'm older, but I think my passion has not been toned down.
That's fine. That's interesting. And maybe sometimes being authentic is, is the best thing, because you don't notice that you're different until people tell you that you're different. So it comes across as just being so genuine too, because you're very much yourself. And I think that, again, that's very disarming, and it's very heartwarming too. So maybe I'll go a little bit into the activism. So how did you become involved in environmental activism, especially with a focus on mining? And I was curious about that because there are a number of different environmental issues, obviously in South Africa and globally. So what made you go in, focus your efforts on mining in particular?
Yes, it first started with a victory against Rolled Out Shell Group. It was at that stage the largest oil company in the world. And Rolled Out Shell Group wanted to build their highway Shell Ultra Cities opposite my home. So my initial activism was motivated basically by narrow self-interest. It was a long journey. It started in 1995 and it ended in 2002. And at first I had the support of the community, but we often refer to objectors fatigue. So in time, people become fatigued. And in the end, I was the only activist against Shell. And I think they realized that perhaps they should approach me. And well, it was an offer of a bribe. They offered to build a tennis court, enclosed swimming pools, terraced gardens opposite my home. Also offered to pay for a holiday in Cape Town to meet the directors and Sir Mark Moody Stewart. And I then accepted the offer to go to Cape Town. I said if they would also be so kind to also invite the thousands of other interested and affected parties, because they obviously would also be affected by the highway petrol stations. Well, in the end, what happened is I was asked to speak at the World Summit for a Sustainable Development. It was a preamble, and I was asked to relate the experience with Shell. And the night before I was to present my paper, Shell arrived at my home and announced that they have abandoned all their plans to develop these ultra cities. They were sensitive to the views of the people, and I still delivered my paper, but it was very well received. And there was a significant interest by the news media because of this insignificant woman who now had a victory against Rolled Out Shell Group. And of course, Shell did keep their promise. And I think it instilled in me a sense of grandiosity. I felt that this insignificant woman can really make a difference. I was then approached by the 53 landowners of one of the richest gold mines and uranium mines in the world. It was at that stage owned by Gold Fields, an international gold mining company. Unfortunately, as a result of the mining, their land was no longer it could no longer be farmed. Their water also dried up. The name of their farm was West Driefontein, which in English means West Three Fountains. So the fountains also, as a result of dewatering, then dried up. I was successful in getting damages for the family, but it also then exposed me to the legacy of gold mining, because over the 120 years of mining by more than 120 mining companies, it created the largest gold and uranium mining basin in the world. The mining companies extracted 43,500 tons of gold and 73,000 tons of uranium during 1953 and 1995, but it left a legacy of 6 billion tons of iron pyrite tailings and 600,000 tons of uranium. And of course, uranium will remain radioactive for geological ages, not just biological ages. So I think that sense of the injustice, the inequity, the power of mining companies, the fact that often mining companies move on, leaving gaping holes in the ground, polluted rivers, and unenriched and disrupted communities. I think that was the motivating factor why I started with the activism relating to mining activities.
Wow, that is a fascinating journey. It's fascinating also because, Mariette, your background doesn't mention anything about being a geologist or a biologist or having a master's degree in environmental science or law. Just academically, when you talk about the experience with Royal Dutch Shell and giving a paper at this large symposium, how do you go from doing what you did before to all of a sudden you're giving a paper? Did you always have a bit of an academic bent? Were you always interested in that type of research?
No, not in environmental sciences, but I was a Jehovah's Witness, and as you know, that Jehovah's Witnesses must refute very strongly entrenched doctrines in order to make disciples. And I think that was perhaps the fact that during my 30 years as an ordained minister of Jehovah's Witnesses, I learned to reason, to use factual evidence to refute strongly entrenched ideas and doctrines, to stand up against conservative organizations such as religious bodies and also governmental bodies. And I think that perhaps was a very good foundation. We also were trained in public speaking. So all of that, I think, was of benefit in the activism. So I no longer was perhaps preaching from door to door regarding the doctrines of Jehovah's Witnesses, but I was now preaching from shack to shack against the environmental degradation and the pollution of mining companies.
Oh, thanks. It's a little bit of a story of destiny too, because by that journey, that's what got you here, and that's what has made you so effective and has helped you impact so many people. And that's really the important part here is there's a bit of a focus of that in the film, but I think it's more afterwards, and maybe you could tell us a bit more about that, because the work you've done has been very impactful for communities and for individuals. So I'm just wondering if you could tell us a bit about what's happened since the film was made, and kind of some headways, successes. And I know when we've been corresponding a little bit, and you have a long list of successes that have come about as a result of your activism and as a result of the film specifically, because the film in a way has created an impact campaign and continues to. The fact that it's now in Canada, it's here on the west coast of BC, is a testament to that. Maybe you could just mention 2 or 3 of the most impactful successes that have come out of your activism and out of your work in this area in the film.
Yes, of course, the film contributed undoubtedly to some of the changes in our legislation. For example, our financial regulations have been amended for mining companies to now include also financial provisioning for latent or residual impacts that may become known in the future, and the pumping and treatment of extraneous water. It also resulted in the implementation of the short-term treatment of acid mine drainage, which is widely considered to be the most costly and socio-economic impact within mining, especially coal and gold mining. It has also resulted in the relocation of the Tudor Shaft informal settlement from a radioactive mine residue area to a safe area. It has also resulted in the National Nuclear Regulator, who is the entity to protect the public, the property, and the environment against radioactivity or radioactive nuclear damage, to also draft the rehabilitation. That is the rehabilitation plan of radioactive contaminated land, and to establish criteria and requirements for the rehabilitation. It also has resulted in amendments to the national dust regulations. The proposed national mine closure strategy had been also implemented, and the proposed national mine water management policy was also as a result of the activism and also the exposure through the Jozi Gold film. I also just want to mention that I, on behalf of my organization, the Federation for a Sustainable Environment, had been had been appointed as a human rights monitor and a human rights champion by the South African Human Rights Commission. The mining communities and also the mining companies had also approached my organization to conduct surveys with mining affected communities, to facilitate social and environmental programs, to conduct training workshops, to conduct environmental tours, and to act as a watchdog. So there have been, I would think, successes after the screening of Jozi Gold, and that is heartening.
Thank you. Thanks. And it does remind me of towards the end of the film. You're speaking to two mining executives who have just taken over the mine. I think that might have been the Blyvoor mine, and just that there's an openness there that probably wouldn't have been there 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But I think that there was an openness to take responsibility, but to look at overall responsibility, because of course this has been going on for over 100 years. So there's a kind of a collective responsibility there, and it's hard to apportion who is responsible for what. But I thought that was a really encouraging dialogue in the film too, towards the end. So I'm going to move over to you, Jamie, because I'm interested in what you see, your impressions of the film and your reaction to the film, as well as whether you're seeing similar issues in the work that you do with MiningWatch.
Sure. Well, first, I think I'm just really, really happy to see this issue being exposed. I think in my work coming into, working with MiningWatch and coming into South Africa and I think many years ago now, and learning about the issues there, and the acid mine drainage, the tailings dust, and so on, was kind of mind-boggling. You have thousands and thousands of people, basically living in the midst of these tailings, these toxic radioactive tailings. You also have basically an underground sea of radioactive water creeping up from below. That within the next few decades, the entire water table will be contaminated, and nobody has any idea what to do with it. That is kind of astonishing, and to so it really needs a lot of attention and a lot of work to get to the point of trying to find solutions, trying to deal with the parts that can be dealt with, and to look for longer term solutions all around. So I'm very, very happy to see this, and it's also, I think, really rewarding to see Mariette at work. And she spoke about her approach to things, and I think it's really interesting to watch, as an outsider, but to see the relationship that she has built with the communities, and the connection and the support that she's able to provide. Because there's also community organizing going on. There's a lot of response to these situations, and it's really, I think, interesting to see that dynamic at work, and the way in which Mariette is able to, join in and provide her expertise and support and play a role in advocating and activating in these situations.
I think so too. When I think of mining in Canada, and I think of the issue here, a lot of it is closely linked with our communities, and a lot of it is Indigenous communities, and it really taps into responsibilities around reconciliation with Indigenous people in Canada. So I wonder, when you're looking at it, Jamie, is that a very different lens? I mean, the communities that Mariette speaks to, do you see similarities in that, or do you see that as being significantly different?
It is and it isn't. I mean, the dynamic is different in the sense that our major cities are not built on top of mines, but there are districts in places like Northern Quebec and Northern Ontario in particular, fewer in the rest of the country, but where places like Timmins or Sudbury or Val-d'Or, where there are gold mining districts and people are living in the midst of mines, and subsidence from mines causes car dealerships to collapse into the earth from time to time. It's really quite spectacular. But and there are lakes that are dead as a result of, or that have just been filled up with mine waste, and so the impacts are there. They're just further from the public view, and I think perhaps fortunately affect relatively fewer people, but they still, we're still talking about people's livelihoods, people's lives, and entire ecosystems being destroyed by historic mining, but also into the present. And I think maybe that's the difference, is that in Canada, the mining and especially gold mining is still expanding. We have dozens and dozens of active gold mines across the country. And, I think gold in particular is something that we actually don't need to mine more of. There's so much in circulation, so much already been, as I think David Van Veek points out in the film, it's been dug up over here and buried again over there in a vault. So, we don't actually need to keep doing that just for profit. It's not actually providing anything useful for industry or, for the betterment of humankind.
I think I know in the film there's a comment that's made by one of the speakers, and he says that to make I think it was a teaspoon of gold, it creates 1 ton of waste, and it was just this very startling fact. And so I guess if we're thinking of now, Jamie, bringing us back to now, as you said too, now in Canada, but also in South Africa, what do you think of Mariette's approach to activism and focusing on cooperation rather than oppositional engagement? And again, we saw a little bit of that at the end of the film, and especially Mariette's comments about now being brought in to do surveys and being brought in at an earlier stage. So I just wonder what you thought of that. Is that something that's as effective here in Canada? Have you seen that be effective? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think all approaches are necessary. I'm not attached to one particular set of tactics and it depends on the situation. I think to a large extent, it's change doesn't happen without pressure. So I think, we need to have maybe a more confrontational or aggressive approach in many situations to create the pressure for movement, for change to happen. But it's also very helpful to have that being assisted and facilitated. Often, I think companies that are beginning to respond to pressure also need some guidance. And we try to provide that at a high level to say, these are the requirements that need to be in place and so on. But to have somebody who's willing to step in and say, in a particular situation, you need to look at this, you need to look at that, you need to take responsibility for this, these particular aspects, and how to exercise that, I think is very useful. But I will say, I having both in the film and having watched Mariette at work, her work with the companies is not uncritical. It's not soft per se. It's very direct, and you see that in the film where she says, this is your responsibility. And I think it's with Sibanye Gold and the the president CEO is trying to say, oh well, we didn't do all this. It's been here for a century, and she says, well, you bought it, it's yours. So, I think that kind of directness is very important in that setting, for sure.
Absolutely. I think so. This is this kind of goes to the next question. I'm going to ask Mariette the question first, and then you, Jamie. But how do you reconcile the contradictory or often contradictory goals of the mining industry that focuses on economic advantage with your own goals around safe and sustainable outcomes? And maybe I'll ask you that first, Mariette, and then Jamie, I'm also curious about your thoughts, because I did read a couple of your blogs when you talk about green goals and the fact that so-called green goals are sometimes not so green when you're looking at impacts to communities. So first, though, I'll ask you, Mariette, do you think that those are contradictory, and how can we reconcile that?
Yes, perhaps first I must just mention that in terms of our constitution, which is considered to be the best in the world, that is the axiom of all our laws, the section 24 of our constitution dictates that there should be sustainable ecological development and justifiable economic development, and there should be inter and intragenerational equity. So for any mining company to justify or motivate their mining activities, they will have to establish not only the motivation on the profits or the development costs or the operational costs. They will also have to demonstrate that they will have the financial resources to also address the non-internalized externalities, the impacts, and also the pollution, the ecological degradation after mine closure. So the costs must then include not just during operation, but also post-closure, because in the legacy of mining focused on the non-internalization of a model, which of course then the impacts are being carried by communities, a mute environment, future generations, beleaguered municipalities, and the state. So while we are not opposed to development, development must include the polluter pays principle. It must include the internalization of externalities. And then furthermore, the three elements with regards to sustainable development, namely the environmental element, the social element, and the economic element. We understand these elements not to be equal, but to be hierarchical. In other words, that you cannot have any sustainable social and economic development on a deteriorating environmental base. So that for us is very important. I also just want to here mention that in South Africa, we have a very large percentage of unemployed persons. We also have communities that are characterized by widespread poverty. These communities need work, but what we also endeavor is to create awareness amongst the communities, not only for short-term benefits, but mining must also produce long-term and medium-term benefits. Mining must also, when they cease mining, must ensure that there is sustainable livelihood opportunities as well as sustainable future land use. So I think this is the nexus between economic development and also then environmental sustainability.
That's great, thank you. I think that's fascinating and definitely the way to go forward without all of these things being out of balance. Jamie, thoughts on Mariette's comments, or just on your experience in Canada or with MiningWatch around the world?
Sure. It's interesting, you know, that the dynamic has changed within the industry quite radically, so that, you know, the sales pitch is often for jobs, but what's actually just being created is profit. You know, we see large scale mines now employ a few hundred people, not thousands, and certainly not tens of thousands. You know, and that's changed just over the last few decades quite radically. And now we're looking at even more automation, self-driving trucks, you know, remote control drills, and so on. So the actual, you know, potential impact in favor of local communities is actually diminishing progressively, especially if there's no useful sort of revenue sharing or benefit sharing set up. The other aspect, and I think it's probably as true in South Africa as it is in Canada, and Mariette mentioned the you know, the poverty around the mines. Often we find, you know, Indigenous communities in remote parts of Canada agreeing to mining projects basically because they have nothing else on offer. That, you know, they're suffering from basically colonial depredation over the last century and more. and they've been left in a situation of abject poverty and exclusion. And this is the only thing that's being offered. You know, there in many cases, you know, communities may have other plans, they may have other demands, but the only thing that's being offered to them is mining. So, you know, and leaders have often said, you know, the only reason that they're agreeing to this is because they felt they didn't have any choice. They didn't have the ability to say no, and they didn't have the ability to impose other conditions on what's happening within their own territories. So, you know, and in fact, it seems like there are much better development and employment opportunities in the cleanup than there are in the actual mining. So, you know, we see this contradiction emerging, and again, especially when it comes to gold, that, you know, what's being created is not actually useful. What's being left is a liability that may actually be worth more and be more expensive than the product that was actually produced. We have now a couple of mines in Canada that are costing $1 billion to clean up after the mining is finished. And so I think the response is to really try to look at the broader economic picture. So, you know, when you look at a mining project, what are the negative economic impacts as much as environmental or social against the benefits, and the benefits that go to the shareholders as opposed to the host communities. And, you know, the response to that is to try and bring those costs into the frame. So, you know, when it comes to mine waste, to make sure that the liabilities for cleanup are being addressed, that the mining companies have to put bonds up front to cover those costs, that they're not effectively being subsidized with, you know, cheap electricity or infrastructure that's being provided by governments. This is certainly an issue in BC, where the royalty rates, the money that's being collected for mining by government is very low, but the liabilities are huge. And, you know, I think we'll give the provincial government some credit for moving to try and make sure that those long-term liabilities are being covered. There's still lots of abandoned mines that need to be cleaned up, but you know, trying to shift that cost back into the industry to say, if you can't afford to build something that's safe, and we've talked about things like tailing safety requirements. If you can't afford to build a tailings facility that's actually safe, and if you can't afford to put the cleanup costs up front, then you don't get to build a mine. It's that simple. You know, some things can't be justified, and then they shouldn't be done. The other aspect is, and to some extent, it's also imposing costs back on industry, but is to ensure that the regulations are effective. You know, environmental protection, health protection regulations are in place, are effective, and are actually being enforced. And that provides, you know, a measure of safety to the public, to the environment, and so on.
You know, I think that when we talk about the subject, we could talk about remediation, the cost, the time that remediation takes, because it's a long time to remediate the land to come back to where it was, or anything close to it, the water tables, all of that. So I think that we've already had a rich discussion. I think we could spend another hour having an even richer discussion on more of this. So I just wanted to thank all of you. And Sylvia, I know there's a piece on Zama Zama in the film as well. I was fascinated by that, and just the, you know, filming that, and I'm sure there were some risks associated with being in those abandoned mines. But that would have to wait for you know, another panel discussion. But I would like to just thank all of you. Just, you all brought something unique. Sylvia, it's a wonderful film that was made. The cinematography was amazing. The editing, it was all such a great film, just from a purely artistic perspective. But having Mariette, having you as the feature, really brought something unique to it. And I really do think, back to Sylvia's comment, it did make it really different, and that difference had an impact, and that impact is making a difference in communities. So just thank you so much also for the work that you've done and that you will continue to do. And then I would like to thank you, Jamie, just for making it real for us here in BC and in Canada, and for grounding it in what this means to us in Canada, and the experiences that we have and what we can do here in Canada. So thank you all. I know we're at the end of the hour, so I just want to mention that there's a Jozi Gold Facebook page for anyone who wants to follow the film and learn a bit more. There are videos and all sorts of things on the Facebook page. There's the MiningWatch website, and there are a number of different blogs that Jamie has written that will also provide more light into this issue. And again, Mariette's organization is another one to look at, the FSC, the Federation for a Sustainable Environment. So I think a lot of different sources if you want to continue to learn more about this. And I wish you all a great day. And Sylvia, I hope that there are more films ahead for us to watch. So thank you all, and have a great morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in your time zone. Thanks.
Thank you, Yvette.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.